37 times. That's the number historians would argue about for decades. Some said 36, some said 40. But the people who were actually there, the 150 people standing in that Harlem bar on that sweltering Friday night in August 1935, they all agreed on one thing: nobody counted. When you're watching a man get systematically destroyed in front of your eyes, when you're watching another human being lose his vision, when you're watching what amounts to a public execution disguised as a restaurant brawl, you don't stand there with a notepad tallying the blade strikes. You stand there, frozen, terrified, understanding in that moment that you're witnessing something that will define your neighborhood for generations to come. And when it was all over, when Ulysses Rollins was bleeding out on the hardwood floor of Jack's Place bar, when the ambulance was pulling up outside with its bell clanging through the Harlem night, that's when Bumpy Johnson did something nobody expected. He didn't run, he didn't celebrate with his crew, he didn't even check himself for injuries. Instead, he walked back to his table, straightened his tie, looked at the shell-shocked waiter who was trembling against the back wall, and ordered a brandy and steak, not spaghetti. That part was never true, though the legend grew so large it swallowed the facts whole. He ordered a brandy and a medium-rare steak with potatoes, and he sat there eating while the man he'd just destroyed was being loaded onto a stretcher with his left eye permanently gone from his skull. This is the real story. Not the cleaned-up version. Not the Hollywood version. This is what actually happened on August 16, 1935, in Harlem, New York, when the most dangerous man in the neighborhood decided to send a message so clear, so brutal, so final, that it would reshape the entire criminal underworld of New York City. Let's go back to the summer of that year. Picture Harlem in 1935. The Great Depression is strangling America. But Harlem is alive in a way no other neighborhood is alive. The music is better. The clubs are fuller. The streets are electric with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lenox Avenue is the spine of the neighborhood, and running through those streets is money, enormous amounts of money. The numbers game, the numbers racket, the policy racket, call it what you want, but it's the lifeblood of Harlem's economy, the one game where a poor man could put down a nickel and dream of becoming a millionaire by tomorrow afternoon. And that money, millions of dollars flowing through the neighborhood every single week, belongs to exactly two people at the top of this ecosystem. On one side, Dutch Schultz. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, though nobody who valued their life called him that. He was a German Jewish mobster who controlled roughly half of New York's underground economy. He had his fingers in prostitution, bootlegging, loan sharking, and most importantly, he had a piece of the numbers game. But having a piece wasn't enough for Dutch Schultz. He wanted all of it, not just half of Harlem's numbers game, not just the wealthy parts of Harlem. He wanted every single corner, every single street corner, every single tenement building where people were playing their daily numbers. He wanted it all, and he was willing to kill as many black men as it took to take it. On the other side, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, he was 30 years old in 1935, born in the South Carolina Low Country, the son of former sharecroppers. His mother had brought him north when he was young, but Bumpy had found his real education on the streets of Harlem. He'd started as a stick-up kid, a street robber, nothing special, but he had something that couldn't be taught. He had an almost supernatural understanding of violence. He knew how to read a man's movements before that man knew what he was going to do. He knew where to cut, where to hit, how much force to apply. By his late 20s, he'd become the enforcer for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen who actually ran Harlem's policy game, the Black Duchess, as they called her. And Bumpy had made her a promise that he'd made to himself as well. Harlem stays black no matter what, no matter who comes, no matter how much money they have, no matter how many soldiers they send. Harlem stays black. Dutch Schultz sent his men into Harlem in waves, dozens of them, big men, tough men, men with guns and no hesitation about using them. But Harlem wasn't like the Lower East Side, where Schultz had originally built his empire. Harlem had geography on its side, Harlem had loyalty, Harlem had Bumpy Johnson. For 6 months, Schultz's men kept disappearing, not all at once, one here, two there. Some found in the Hudson River, some found beaten so badly they couldn't testify about what happened. Some simply vanished. Bumpy didn't need an army. He had 9 men he trusted completely, and he had the entire neighborhood watching for him. The shoeshine boys who worked the corners, they reported to Bumpy, the flower vendors, the prostitutes, the delivery boys, the nightclub hostesses. They all had eyes and ears, and they all worked for Bumpy Johnson. By August, Dutch Schultz was getting desperate. He needed someone special. He needed someone who could match Bumpy's violence with violence. Someone who wouldn't be afraid. Someone who could actually handle this Harlem kid who kept making him look foolish. So he made a call to Chicago. Ulysses Rollins was 6'2", 240 pounds, and every single ounce of him was muscle and scar tissue. He was a killer, a real killer, not some street hustler who'd gotten lucky a few times. Rollins had murdered 11 men before his 25th birthday. They called him the Bull in Chicago because when he charged, physics itself seemed to bend around him. He didn't fight like a man. He fought like an animal in a cage. He'd crushed men's skulls with his bare hands. He'd stabbed men and watched them die while he laughed. He was the kind of human being who made other violent men nervous. Dutch Schultz offered him $15,000, $5,000 up front, $10,000 more if he brought back proof that Bumpy Johnson was dead. And Schultz gave him one specific instruction: make it loud, make it public, make it so brutal that every numbers runner in Harlem understands what happens if they don't fall in line. Rollins took the job. He arrived in Harlem on a Tuesday afternoon, stepped off the train at Penn Station like a conquering general, and by Thursday, word had spread through the neighborhood that the Bull was in town. Now, here's where people misunderstand what happened next. Bumpy wasn't worried. That wasn't why his crew moved differently that week. But he was attentive. He was a man who'd learned long ago that complacency is what gets you killed. His network of informants, the invisible structure of Harlem he'd built over years, it went into overdrive. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew everything about Ulysses Rollins. He knew what hotel he was staying at, the Lenox Hotel on 125th Street. He knew what he ate for breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, black coffee. He knew what he drank: whiskey, neat. He knew what weapons he carried: a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster, a hunting knife in his boot. He knew Rollins was arrogant. That was the important part. He knew the Bull believed his own mythology. That Friday night, Bumpy had plans. He'd met a woman 3 weeks earlier at the Roseland Ballroom. Her name was Helen Lawson, and she was everything a woman. Like that shouldn't be fraternizing with a man like him. She was educated, graduated from an Ivy League college. She was a senior editor at Vanity Fair magazine. She wrote about theater and film for an audience of Manhattan's elite. She was cultured, sophisticated, and she was white. More importantly, she was smart. She wasn't doing research on Harlem because she wanted to patronize it or sensationalize it for her magazine's readers. She was genuinely curious. She saw Harlem as more than just the crime and the poverty. She understood that something important was happening in this neighborhood, that the culture being created there was transforming American music, American literature, American everything. She'd come to a jazz club late one night, and Bumpy had been there, and they'd started talking, and he'd been honest with her about what he was. She'd looked at him and made a choice. She wanted to know this man. Bumpy had invited her to dinner at Jack's Place. Not because it was the fanciest restaurant in Harlem, though it was certainly upscale. Jack's Place was exclusive. It had a bar up front with hardwood flooring. It had a dining room in the back. It had live music on Friday nights. It was the kind of place where lawyers ate alongside hustlers, where doctors sat at tables with numbers runners, where you were safe because everyone understood the rules. Jack's Place was Harlem royalty. Bumpy arrived at 8 o'clock on that August Friday night, wearing a charcoal gray suit tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. His tie was burgundy silk. His shoes were polished until they reflected the light like mirrors. His fedora was cocked at a precise angle. He looked like a banker. He looked like a doctor. He looked like anything except a man capable of what he was about to do. Helen was already at the bar. She wore a blue dress that fell just below her knees, pearls around her throat, her hair done up in the fashion of the time. She had the kind of presence that made men turn their heads, but she didn't seem to notice. She was looking at Bumpy, and when he approached her, she smiled. They ordered drinks, whiskey, and soda for Bumpy, a cocktail, something with gin for Helen. They talked. She asked him about growing up in the South, about what it felt like to come north as a child, about whether he had any dreams beyond the life he was living. He asked her about working at a magazine in a world dominated by men, about whether she got tired of trying to explain herself to people who couldn't understand her perspective. The conversation was easy, the bar was warm, the music was soft, a jazz quartet playing something low and smooth. The rest of the bar was full, maybe 150 people. Friday night regulars, club owners, hustlers, working girls, entertainers, respectable citizens doing respectable things while living respectable lives. Bumpy and Helen fit right in. At 8:47, the front door opened. Ulysses Rollins walked in like he owned the place. His shoulders were back, his jaw was clenched. His eyes were scanning the room like a hunter who'd just caught a scent. He was looking for someone. Bumpy saw him immediately, recognized the type, understood what this meant. This wasn't a man coming for a drink. This was a man coming for a killing. Bumpy and Rollins made eye contact across the crowded bar. Rollins smiled. Not a smile of recognition, not a smile of greeting. It was the smile of a predator who's found his prey. The smile of a man about to collect $15,000. Helen noticed the change in Bumpy instantly. The relaxed gentleman sitting across from her, the man who'd been asking her intelligent questions and making her feel seen, disappeared. In his place was something harder, something colder, something that looked human but wasn't quite human anymore. "Bumpy," Helen said quietly, "is everything all right?" "Yeah," Bumpy said, not taking his eyes off Rollins. "Everything's fine. Give me just a minute." Rollins made his way through the bar with deliberate slowness. He wanted the entire room to see this. This was the performance Dutch Schultz had paid him for. This was the public humiliation and execution of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy waited. He didn't stand up, he didn't run, he didn't reach for a weapon. He sat there calmly, watching Rollins approach like a man watching a waiter bring him his order. When Rollins reached the table, he stopped. He was standing. Bumpy was sitting. The physicality of that was supposed to matter. The bull was supposed to have the advantage. The bull was supposed to be able to look down at this skinny Harlem boy and make him understand that his time was finished. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Rollins asked, loud enough that the conversations around them started dying out. The music didn't stop, but the people at the nearby tables turned their heads. This was the moment they'd come to witness. "Depends who's asking," Bumpy said. "Dutch Schultz," Rollins said. "He sent me. He says, you're a problem. He says problems need solutions." Bumpy looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a frightened smile. A genuine smile. The kind that made people wonder what he knew that they didn't. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy said, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed. Big words for a man sitting down. That's when Bumpy noticed Rollins's hand. It was drifting, subtle, casual, but it was definitely drifting toward Rollins's jacket, toward the shoulder holster, toward the .45 caliber pistol. And Bumpy made a decision in the space of a single heartbeat. If Rollins pulled that gun, people would die. Not just Rollins, not just Bumpy. Helen would die. The jazz musicians would die. The bartender would die. The waiter would die. A bullet in a crowded bar doesn't care who it hits. It just kills whatever it finds. Bumpy couldn't let that happen. So he moved first. What happened next, what everyone in that bar witnessed, happened in approximately 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds would be recounted and re-recounted for decades, mythologized and dramatized, and eventually transformed into something that barely resembled what actually occurred. But this is what actually occurred. Bumpy's hand shot out toward the table. In one motion, smooth and practiced, he grabbed the steak knife beside his dinner plate. The knife was 6 inches long, serrated edge, sharp enough to cut through bone, sharp enough to cut through the soft tissue of a human face. Bumpy came up out of his chair like he was spring-loaded. The chair fell backward, crashed against the floor. Helen gasped and lunged backward, away from the table. Bumpy drove the knife forward. The first cut caught Rollins across the forearm as he was drawing his pistol. The blade went deep into the muscle. Rollins screamed. His hand involuntarily released the gun, and it clattered to the floor. The second cut opened Rollins's cheek. Not a minor wound, a serious wound. The blade went in 4 inches deep, and when Bumpy pulled it back out, Rollins's blood came with it, a hot spray across the white tablecloth. By the third cut, Rollins realized something fundamental. He wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting something else, something that moved like water. Something that struck with the precision of someone performing surgery. They crashed into a nearby table. Glasses shattered, food went flying, a woman screamed so loud her voice cracked. Cut 4, caught Rollins across the ribs. Cut 5, found his shoulder. Cut 6, opened his neck. Not deep enough to kill him, but deep enough that Rollins understood he was dying. He tried to fight back. He was bigger, he was stronger. He had 30 pounds of muscle advantage, but none of it mattered. Every time he threw a punch, Bumpy was already gone, already moving, and the knife was already finding flesh. Cut 7, cut 8, cut 9. Bumpy wasn't frenzied. This was the thing that terrified people. This wasn't rage. This was mathematics. This was a man applying precise amounts of force to exact locations on another human being's body. This was someone who understood anatomy the way a butcher understands meat. Cut 12 caught Rollins across the ribs again. Cut 18 opened his shoulder. Rollins was making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. He was on his knees by cut 20. Blood was pouring from a dozen different wounds. His shirt was soaked through. His face was a mask of blood. And that's when Bumpy went for the eyes. In all the chaos, Helen had moved away from the table. She was pressed against the wall near the bar, surrounded by other terrified patrons, but she couldn't look away. She watched as Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd been asking her about Langston Hughes' poetry 5 minutes earlier, methodically destroyed another human being. The knife was an extension of Bumpy's hand. Every movement was precise. Every movement was calculated. This wasn't passion. This was a man doing a job he'd been trained to do since he was a teenager on the streets of Harlem. Cut 25. Caught Rollins above his left eye. The blade went in deep. When Bumpy pulled it back, Rollins's eyeball came with it. The damage was severe, permanent. Rollins would spend the rest of his life seeing out of only one eye, but Bumpy wasn't done. Cut 26, 27, 28. Rollins was beyond fighting now. He was just trying to protect his face with his hands, but his hands were pouring blood, and his coordination was gone. Bumpy kept cutting. Cut 31 opened Rollins's arm. Cut 34 found his shoulder. Cut 36 caught him across the jaw. And cut 37, the final cut, was across Rollins's face, from his cheekbone to his jaw. A slash that would scar him for the rest of his life. And then Bumpy stopped. He stood up. He was covered in blood. Not his blood, Rollins's blood. His suit was ruined. His tie was hanging at an angle. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from exertion or adrenaline, nobody could say. Rollins was on the floor. He was conscious. He was breathing. But he was finished. He was whimpering. He was crying. He was a man who'd come to Harlem to collect $15,000 and had instead lost an eye and any remaining sense of his own invulnerability. The entire bar had gone silent. The jazz quartet had stopped playing. The bartender was frozen behind the bar. 150 people stood absolutely still, understanding in that moment that they'd just witnessed something that would reshape their entire neighborhood. Bumpy reached down and adjusted his tie. The gesture was so casual, so deliberate, so absolutely calm that it sent a chill through every person in that bar. This man had just destroyed another human being. This man had just administered 37 knife wounds to another person's body. And he was straightening his tie like he'd just finished a business meeting. Then Bumpy stepped over Rollins's body, not around it, over it. He stepped directly over the bleeding man, like Rollins was a puddle in his path, like he was nothing, like he was less than human. He walked back to his table. Helen was still standing by the wall, staring at him. Bumpy met her eyes and smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not an arrogant smile. A smile that said, "I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry you know what I'm capable of now." He picked up his chair, which was lying on the floor. He set it upright. He sat down. He looked at Helen, and his voice was perfectly calm. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "That was rude of me." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The entire bar was holding its breath. Bumpy looked around for their waiter. The man was pressed against the back wall behind the bar, white-faced with shock. Bumpy caught his eye and gestured with his hand. "Excuse me?" Bumpy called out. His voice was polite. "Could we get some service? I seem to have worked up an appetite." The waiter didn't move. Bumpy smiled. He reached over and picked up a menu from a nearby empty table. He studied it for a moment. The rest of the bar was still frozen. Nobody was eating, nobody was drinking. Everyone was watching. I'm going to have a brandy, Bumpy said, not to the waiter, but to Helen, and a steak, medium rare, with potatoes. What are you going to have? Helen couldn't speak. Her legs felt like water. Her stomach felt like it was trying to turn itself inside out. She'd watched a man's eye be removed from his socket. She'd watched another human being be systematically destroyed. And now she was sitting across from the man who'd done it, and he was asking her what she wanted to eat. I don't think I can eat, Helen managed to say. You should try, Bumpy said gently. You're in shock. You need to put something in your stomach. By this time, police sirens were audible outside. An ambulance was already pulling up to the curb. Bumpy ignored it. He looked at Helen, and she saw something in his eyes that made her realize what this whole evening had been about. Did you know? She asked. When you invited me here, did you know he was going to come? No, Bumpy said. But I knew it was possible. That's why I asked you to come here instead of somewhere else. Here, in a place I control, in a place where I have friends. If it was going to happen, this was the safest place it could happen. The medics came in. They were professional about it, but Helen could see the shock on their faces when they saw the state Rollins was in. They put him on a stretcher. They started checking his vital signs. One of them noticed that Rollins's left eye was hanging from the socket, and he looked like he was going to be sick. The police arrived next. They were Harlem police, which meant they were either Bumpy's men or men who'd learned long ago not to get in Bumpy's way. One of the officers walked over to Bumpy's table. He was a tall black man with gray at his temples. Mr. Johnson, the officer said respectfully, we're going to need a statement. Of course, Bumpy said. This man came in and attempted to draw a weapon. I defended myself. You can talk to the 150 witnesses in this room? The officer nodded. He looked around the bar. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody volunteered anything. In Harlem, you didn't testify against Bumpy Johnson unless you wanted to spend the rest of your life wondering when he was coming for you. Self-defense, the officer said to his partner. Weapon drawn, multiple witnesses. We're done here. The waiter, hands still trembling, brought Bumpy his brandy. Bumpy picked it up and sipped it. It was good brandy, the kind that costs money, the kind that only certain people can afford to drink. He sipped it and waited for his steak. Helen sat across from him, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what she'd witnessed. She watched Bumpy sip his brandy. She watched him look around the bar with the calm demeanor of a man who'd just done something he'd had to do, something that needed doing, something he had no regrets about. 10 minutes later, the waiter brought the steak. It was cooked perfectly. The meat was pink inside, the potatoes were golden. Steam rose from the plate. Bumpy cut into the steak. He brought a piece to his mouth. He chewed, he swallowed, he took another bite. It's good, he said to Helen. Really good. You should eat something. Helen looked at her own plate, which had been knocked aside during the fight, which was covered in blood and broken glass. She shook her head. Bumpy ate 3 more bites. Each one deliberate, each one a statement. By the time the medics had loaded Rollins onto the ambulance and were pulling away from the curb, Bumpy had finished half his steak. The police left. The bar gradually came back to life, but it was different now. The conversations were quieter. The music started again, but it sounded tentative, unsure. The entire nature of the space had changed. Everyone in that bar understood that they'd crossed a threshold, that the world before 847 was different from the world after 847. Helen watched Bumpy eat. She watched him finish his brandy and order another. She watched him behave like a man who'd done nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. And she understood something in that moment. She understood who Bumpy Johnson really was. Not the man who'd been friendly and charming 3 hours earlier. Not the man who'd quoted poetry and asked her about her life. This was Bumpy Johnson. This was who he'd been since childhood. This was the foundation everything else was built on. When they left the bar, Bumpy took Helen's arm gently. They walked out into the Harlem night. The street was cool. The stars were visible above the buildings. They walked for several blocks without speaking. Finally, Helen said, "That man came to kill you." "Yes," Bumpy said, "and you knew he was going to." "Yes. So the whole evening was what? A trap." Bumpy stopped walking. He turned to Helen, and there was something in his eyes that might have been sadness. "I didn't set a trap," he said. "I just lived my life." But when a man comes to kill you in front of innocent people, you handle it fast and you handle it final so everyone knows what happens next time. so no one ever tries again. By Saturday morning, the story had spread through Harlem like electricity moving through water. Everyone knew what had happened. Not just that there'd been violence, Harlem had seen violence every day, but the way Bumpy had handled it, the calm, the precision, the absolutely casual way he'd stepped over a dying man and ordered dinner, that was what people talked about. The men told their sons, the women told their daughters. That's how Bumpy Johnson does his business. That's what it looks like when you're in the presence of real power. Real power isn't just violence. Real power is control. Real power is the ability to destroy a man and then calmly drink a brandy. The story reached Dutch Schultz by noon. By 1 in the afternoon, Dutch Schultz had learned that Ulysses Rollins had lost an eye. By 2 o'clock, he'd learned that Rollins was asking for a ship ticket back to Chicago. That Rollins wanted out. That Rollins understood he'd made a terrible mistake. Schultz was at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx when his lieutenant came in. The lieutenant was white-faced. His hands were shaking. "Boss, we have a problem. Tell me," Schultz said. "Rollins is finished. Bumpy Johnson did him in a bar. Cut him to pieces, took his eye. The bull is broken." Schultz put down his cigar. He sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. "How many men have we lost trying to take Harlem?" he asked finally. 43, the lieutenant said. 43, Schultz repeated. "And Johnson's not even breathing hard. And the bull, this killer we brought in from Chicago, he's asking for a ticket out." Schultz stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the Bronx. He thought about the organization he'd built, about the money flowing through it, about the numbers game, about Harlem. "Call Lucky Luciano," Schultz said. "Tell him we need a sit-down. Tell him I want to negotiate a deal with Bumpy Johnson. Tell him I want to make peace." 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead, murdered on Lucky Luciano's orders. And Bumpy Johnson would walk into a meeting with the Italian mafia and negotiate a deal that would make him the first black man to sit at that table as an equal. He would become the godfather of Harlem. He would rule that neighborhood for the next 30 years. But that all came after. On that Friday night in August 1935, Bumpy Johnson was just a man who'd had dinner at a bar. He was a man who'd encountered a problem and solved it. He was a man who'd ordered a steak and brandy while another man's blood was still wet on the floor. Helen would eventually leave Harlem. She would go back to her job at Vanity Fair. She would marry a man named Robert Lawson, a banker, someone respectable and safe and utterly incapable of what Bumpy Johnson was capable of. She would have children, she would have a normal life, but she would never forget that night. Years later, she would write about it in a memoir that would never be published. She would describe Bumpy as the most contradictory man I ever met. A killer who quoted poetry, a gangster who tipped his hat to old women passing on the street, a man capable of extreme violence who seemed to carry that violence like a cross he was forced to bear. She would write about the 37 cuts, she would write about the brandy, she would write about stepping over a body and the absolute calm with which it was done. And she would understand, in the way that only someone who'd been present could understand, that she'd witnessed something that separated Bumpy Johnson from every other gangster in New York. It wasn't just that he was more dangerous, it was that he was more controlled. It was that he understood power on a level that most men never comprehend, real power. The kind of power that doesn't need to shout about itself. The kind of power that can step over a dying man and order dinner without that action being performative. 37 cuts, one message, one man, one night that would echo through Harlem for the rest of the 20th century. The story of what happened at Jack's place would become legend. But, like all legends, it would be transformed. The details would shift. The numbers would change. The meal became spaghetti instead of steak. The location became different restaurants. But the essential truth remained unchanged. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that night. He'd proven that Harlem couldn't be conquered from the outside. He'd proven that Dutch Schultz's money and muscle meant nothing in a neighborhood that had decided to protect its own. He'd proven that real power isn't measured in the size of your bank account or the number of men you can send into a neighborhood. Real power is measured in your ability to maintain absolute control under absolute pressure. Every mobster in New York heard about that night. Every politician heard about it. Every police officer heard about it, and they all understood the same message. Harlem protects its own. Bumpy Johnson would go on to rule Harlem for the next 30 years. He would go to prison twice. He would serve time in Alcatraz, he would negotiate with the Italian mafia, he would protect Malcolm X, he would become a legend, so complete that it's almost impossible to separate the man from the mythology. But on that August night in 1935 at Jack's place, with 150 witnesses watching him, Bumpy Johnson taught a lesson about power that has never been forgotten. He taught it with precision and calm. He taught it with 37 cuts and a brandy. He taught it by stepping over a broken man and refusing to acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. That's the truth about power. That's the truth about legends. They're not born in the big, dramatic moments. They're born in the small details. They're born in the way a man straightens his tie after destroying someone. They're born in the way he steps over a body like it's nothing. They're born in the way he orders dinner while another man is bleeding out on the floor. 37 cuts. One night, one man, one neighborhood that would never be the same.